Hi everyone, just wanted to show you how to put a good old presentation together for lab. Use this as a template if you want, and if you have any questions, just go and see your lab instructor. So let's get started. So what you see on your screen on the right hand side is the actual presentation. On the left hand side you've got the grading rubric. The first slide should be a title slide. The title should be very precise in terms of what your study is designed to do, what it's designed to measure, and each of the names of the participants should also be on the slide as well. The first part of the presentation is the background information. And as you'll note on the rubric here, it says, does the background information relate to the topic of the investigation? What this means is that the background material has to be relevant to what you want to discuss. So for example, in this particular presentation, the group looked at ventilation. They talk a little bit about ventilation. They talk about inspiration and expiration, the reason why inspiration is important and the reason why expiration is important. And then they go in and talk about the fact that the controlling gas for respiration is a change in carbon dioxide concentration, and the fact that changes in CO2 level are what regulate not only the depth but also the rate of respiration. Because they're looking at the effect of posture, this group also talked about posture and how posture leads to a change in respiration, in this case laboured breathing. And they got this information from references that they'll cite later on in the paper. The background information continues looking at resting pulse and looking at how that changes with different postures. And lastly, they looked at what's referred to as the R wave, which is part of what's referred to as an ECG, which you'll learn a little bit later on in the course. And they talk about how this would change if body position is also altered. And here they're referring to that as the cardiac access. The next slide that you should have after the background are the variables which you test, and there are two variables. One is the independent variable and the other one is the dependent variable. In this case, there are more than one independent variables. In this particular example, we have breathing depth, pulse rate, and R wave amplitude, because these were three of the variables that this group measured. So based on the information that they provided with their background material, this group came up with a hypothesis to test. And what they said was that they predicted that when the person's sitting upright, that breathing depth, pulse rate, and the R wave amplitude will be perfectly normal. However, when this person or these people had a poor posture, they speculated that there would be a change in breathing depth and pulse. In fact, this would increase, but that the R wave amplitude would change, but this group wasn't sure in which direction it would change based on their background material. And that's what this part of the rubric here on the left-hand side is all about, the hypothesis and prediction. The key to this is that it must be based on relevant background information, and that's why the background's so important. If you haven't got an adequate background, it's very hard to come up with a good hypothesis to test. The methods and materials are very important. First of all, according to the rubric, there should be a question and it should be used appropriately for the proposed question. And secondly, the methodology should be controlled with replicates. And what that means essentially is there should be more than one person or one subject that is conducting the experiment, or that you test one subject more than once. A good method slide is clear, concise, can fit all the information onto one slide, and the best way to do it is to bullet the methodology as this group has done. The results are very important. In fact, you can see that there are 4 points associated with the results, and two things we're looking for in the results. One, that the figures that you present, or tables, you can do either or, are appropriately labeled and well prepared, and that this type of presentation style, meaning a figure or a table, is an effective way to summarize the results. So you would probably want to draw a figure, as you see here on the presentation, if you have a lot of data. If you don't have a lot of data, you can get away with just drawing a table. If you are going to draw a figure, then you need to pay attention to a couple of things. One is that it has a clear title, and you can see that this particular graph has a clear title. It's very short, sweet, but to the point. We also note that from their methodology, there is more than one subject. Each one is color-coded, and you can see that subject 1 is over here in blue, subject 2 in red. What you'll also note about this graph is that there is an appropriately labeled x-axis as well as an appropriately labeled y-axis with units. And the final thing you'll note is that the font size is large enough for people in the back of the room to see. So this particular group found that posture did have an effect on breathing depth on both of these subjects, more so than subject 2 compared to subject 1. Second graph looks at changes in pulse rate with changes in posture, and again there was some variability between subject 1 and subject 2. And lastly, when we look at changes in R wave amplitude, there wasn't that much of a change when you compare the baseline with poor posture and recovery for subjects 1 or 2. The only thing though is that in subject 1, the variable, the R wave amplitude, increased during each one of these periods. The discussion is probably the one part that students find most difficult to put together. There are two things we are looking for in the discussion, as stated by the rubric. One is that you explain the results well using physiological principles. Now, where do you get the physiological principle from? Answer is very easy. Start with the lecture that Dr. Cassotti, aka myself, gives you. Textbooks are another good source for physiological principles as well. And it has to relate back and reflect back on the original hypothesis. So if we go back to the presentation, you'll see that they talk again about poor posture and its effects on changes in the thoracic cavity, that it decreases the size of the thoracic cavity, and what that does to breathing depth. In other words, in order for the person to get enough oxygen, breathing depth has to be forced. Again, they're relating it back to what they said in the background material, that chemoreceptors are important and they're detecting changes in CO2 concentration in the plasma. So what this group does is they talk a little bit about the physiology, but then they go and they reflect on their original hypothesis, meaning that they look at breathing depth. And if you remember back to their hypothesis, they stated that breathing depth would increase, and that's actually what they found. They do the same thing with pulse rate, the second variable here. They did find that pulse rate changed and that it would go up with a change in posture, so they mentioned that in a separate bullet point. And lastly, they look at the R wave amplitude. And what they found here was a little bit different than the other two variables. With the R wave amplitude, only one of the subjects showed an increase in the amplitude of that wave, but not the other. So their conclusion and the reflection on their hypothesis was that only 2 out of the 3 predictions which they had initially made were proven correct. You do have to have a future direction slide, and that's what the future experiments is all about. And in other words, the reason you do this is because when you do an experiment, things don't always work out as you predicted. So how would you change the experiment in the future to improve the design? And that's what we're looking for. This particular group said that they would test different positions other than the position that they measured, because they only measured one position. They would probably test more than 2 subjects. They would record the data for a longer period of time, hence giving them more complete data, and they may possibly look at what they term long-term effects on posture, on physiology. The references slide, you get a point for that as well. We're looking for, if you look at the rubric here, at least 3 books or journal articles. If you look on the right-hand side, there's a journal article here, another journal article here, and this is actually, Seeley is the textbook that we have for the class. Pay attention to the style in which the references are portrayed. In other words, that the last name of the first author is shown, followed by their first initial, followed by the year, the title, the journal title itself, as well as where it's found, page and volume number. And this is the way that we want you to do the references. And lastly, there has to be evidence of teamwork. In other words, there are 4 people in each group. Each one has to have participated equally. And the presentation style, it has to be a clear presentation, well organized, as well as well prepared. So these are all the things that we're looking for in a good presentation. So I hope that's been informative, and I hope you've learned a lot from it. And if you have any questions, please go and see your lab instructor.